The system no longer needs you. That is not a prediction. It is a description of how modern economic systems already function. For most of the last century, participation was the foundation of economic stability. People worked, people earned, people consumed, people owned. Wages powered demand, demand powered growth. Growth justified employment. Employment sustained the middle class. The system required millions of people moving in predictable patterns to remain stable. That requirement is gone. The system still grows. Companies still post profits. Markets still function. But the number of people required to keep everything running has quietly shrunk. Not because anyone planned it that way, not because of malice or ideology, but because incentives changed. Once productivity could be separated from labor, the system began reorganizing itself around efficiency rather than participation. What followed was not collapse, but optimization. And optimized systems remove dependencies wherever possible. Human dependency was one of them. This shift did not arrive with a single invention or policy. It emerged gradually across industries, decades, and balance sheets. Each change looked rational on its own. Each decision made sense locally. But together they produced a global structure that no longer depends on broad human involvement to function. Work became less central. Consumers became less essential. Ownership became unnecessary. Stability detached from employment. The system didn't fail. It evolved. For most of the 20th century, labor was the bottleneck. Growth required people. Factories needed workers, offices needed clerks, services needed staff. Expansion meant hiring. Productivity gains increased wages, and wages fed consumption. The middle class existed because the system needed it to exist. That dependency created leverage. When workers were essential, they had bargaining power. When consumers were essential, their participation mattered. When ownership was widespread, stability was shared. But dependency is inefficient. And over time, the system learned how to reduce it. Automation did not arrive as a replacement for humans. It arrived as a supplement. Software made individual workers more productive. Machines reduced error. Systems reduced friction. At first, this strengthened labor. Fewer people could produce more value. But once output could grow without proportional increases in headcount, the relationship between work and growth began to loosen. Then it broke. Productivity continued to rise. Employment did not. This was not immediately visible because the system masked the change. New jobs appeared as old ones disappeared. Titles shifted. Entire industries rebranded themselves as innovation sectors. The appearance of participation remained intact, even as its necessity declined. Behind the scenes, the math changed. A single software platform could replace thousands of clerical workers. A logistics algorithm could outperform teams of planners. A self-service interface could eliminate entire departments. The value was no longer created by labor intensity. It was created by design, scale, and control. Once systems reached sufficient maturity, labor stopped being a growth input and became a cost center. And cost centers are optimized down. This did not produce mass unemployment overnight. Instead, it produced something quieter: job churn, contract work, temporary roles, flattened wages, delayed stability, careers that never fully formed. The system still employed people, it just no longer relied on them. At the same time, financialization changed how success was measured. Companies were once evaluated by their ability to produce goods and employ people profitably. Over time, they were evaluated by margins, capital efficiency, and shareholder returns. Labor-heavy models became liabilities. Asset-light models became ideal. Revenue mattered less than predictability. Employment mattered less than scalability. Customers mattered less than recurring cash flow. Once markets rewarded stability over participation, the incentive structure locked in. This is where rent extraction began to replace value creation. Owning assets became more important than producing things. Controlling platforms became more valuable than serving users. Collecting fees became more reliable than selling products. Housing transformed from shelter into yield. Software transformed from tools into licenses. Transportation transformed from ownership into access. Entertainment transformed from products into subscriptions. In each case, the shift removed the need for long-term consumer engagement. A renter does not need rising wages to keep paying rent. A subscriber does not need ownership to keep renewing. A platform does not need loyalty, only dependency. Once dependency is established, participation becomes optional. This is where the middle class quietly lost its role. The middle class was not valuable because of its culture or values. It was valuable because it was economically necessary. It worked, consumed, and stabilized demand. It was expensive, but it was required. Once systems could extract value without relying on wages, that requirement disappeared. Consumption no longer needed to grow with income. Revenue no longer needed to track employment. Stability no longer needed ownership. Debt filled the gap. Instead of rising wages, households were given access to credit. Instead of savings, they were offered financing. Instead of ownership, they were offered flexibility. Each substitution preserved the appearance of participation while removing its foundation. People still spent. They just didn't earn proportionally. The system learned that demand could be sustained through leverage rather than income, and leveraged consumers are predictable. They don't need raises. They don't need ownership. They just need access. Once this model proved stable, it spread everywhere. Platform economics accelerated the process. Platforms do not require large workforces. They require network effects. Once scale is achieved, marginal costs approach zero. Growth no longer depends on hiring. It depends on user capture. Users generate data. Data improves algorithms. Algorithms increase efficiency. Efficiency increases margins. Human involvement is front-loaded, not ongoing. This is why platform companies can grow exponentially without expanding their labor force. The system no longer needs broad participation once control is established. The same logic applies to consumers. Platforms do not need consumers to be prosperous. They need them to be dependent. A financially constrained user who cannot leave is more valuable than a wealthy one with options. This inversion is subtle but decisive. Traditional systems needed consumers to thrive. Modern systems need consumers to remain engaged. Engagement does not require ownership. It does not require security. It does not require stability. It requires frictionless access and recurring extraction. Subscription models perfected this. Ownership introduces finality. Once someone owns a product, the transaction ends. Subscriptions remove that endpoint. They convert one-time customers into perpetual revenue streams. This is not inherently malicious. It is simply efficient. Efficiency removes excess capacity. Efficiency removes redundancy. Efficiency removes dependence. Human participation is redundant once the system can sustain itself. This is why wages stopped being central. When revenue comes from assets rather than labor, wages become irrelevant to growth. They matter socially, but not structurally. The system can continue functioning even as wages stagnate. This is not a collapse. It is decoupling. The economy did not break from workers. It detached from them. Asset ownership replaced wages as the primary source of stability. Those who owned appreciating assets remained connected to growth. Those who didn't were left participating without influence. Participation without leverage feels like failure, even when it is structurally normal. Most people interpret this as personal inadequacy. It is not. It is system design catching up to its incentives. Corporate consolidation reinforced the pattern. As industries consolidated, competition decreased. Fewer firms controlled more market share. Efficiency increased. Redundancy disappeared. Employment flattened. Large firms do not grow by hiring proportionally. They grow by acquiring, automating, and integrating. Each acquisition removes overlapping roles. Each merger optimizes headcount downward. Consolidation reduces the number of economic actors required to sustain output. Again, no villain is required. The incentives do the work. Over time, the system converged on a structure that is stable, profitable, and minimally dependent on human participation. This does not mean people are unnecessary. It means they are no longer foundational. There is a difference. The system still accommodates people. It just does not require them to thrive. This is why growth can coexist with insecurity, why markets can rise while wages stagnate, why employment can exist without stability. The system is no longer organized around human outcomes. It is organized around efficiency, predictability, and extraction. Once that organization is complete, participation becomes optional, and that is where we are now. The consequences of this shift were not immediate. They unfolded quietly, unevenly, and without a single moment of recognition. Systems rarely announce when they no longer depend on something. They simply stop organizing around it. For a long time, the system continued to look familiar. People still worked. Companies still hired. Consumers still spent. The rituals of participation remained intact, but the underlying function had changed. Work stopped being the primary mechanism of value creation. Consumption stopped being the primary engine of growth. Ownership stopped being the foundation of stability. They became optional layers placed on top of a system that could now sustain itself without them. This is why the change was so difficult to see. Most people assumed the system was still built the same way, just temporarily strained. A bad decade, a slow recovery, a transition period. But the recovery never arrived because nothing was broken. The system was functioning as designed. As labor became less central, the nature of employment shifted. Jobs fragmented, careers shortened, stability was deferred. Long-term employment gave way to flexible arrangements, project-based roles, and contingent labor. From the system's perspective, this was not deterioration. It was risk reduction. Fixed labor is a liability. Variable labor is efficient. By externalizing risk onto individuals, companies insulated themselves from volatility. Workers absorbed instability so firms didn't have to. Income became unpredictable. Benefits disappeared. Security dissolved into optional add-ons. The system did not need to provide stability if stability was no longer essential to output. This is why productivity gains stopped flowing to wages. There was no structural reason for them to do so. Once productivity could be captured without expanding labor participation, wages lost their leverage. This was not punishment. It was irrelevance. At the same time, consumers lost their central role. Traditional economics treated consumption as the engine of growth. People earned, then spent. Spending justified employment. Employment justified wages. The loop sustained itself. That loop is no longer necessary. Revenue can now be generated without mass consumption. Asset appreciation, data extraction, financial flows, and platform rents can sustain growth independently of consumer purchasing power. Consumption still exists. It's just no longer foundational. This is why consumer weakness no longer produces systemic crisis the way it once did. The system does not collapse. When households struggle because households are no longer the load-bearing structure, the system learned how to grow without them. Housing is a clear example. Shelter was once tied to income. Mortgages were underwritten based on wages. Home ownership was distributed because it stabilized communities and sustained demand. That logic no longer applies. Housing now functions as a financial asset first and shelter second. Value is derived from scarcity, appreciation, and rent extraction. Occupancy is secondary. This shift does not require widespread ownership. It benefits from concentration. Renters do not need rising incomes to remain profitable. They need access and obligation. Ownership is inefficient when returns can be captured without it. The system does not need homeowners. It needs assets. The same pattern repeats across industries. Transportation no longer requires ownership. Software no longer requires purchase. Entertainment no longer requires collections. Tools no longer require permanence. Access replaces possession because access preserves control. Once control is centralized, the system no longer needs participants to be stable or prosperous. It needs them to remain enrolled. This is where dependency replaces participation. Dependency is more reliable than engagement. A dependent user cannot exit easily. They cannot accumulate leverage. They cannot disengage without cost. This makes them predictable. Predictability is the system's primary objective. Unpredictable humans were once tolerated because they were necessary. Now that necessity has diminished, this is why asset ownership replaced wages as the primary path to stability. Assets scale without effort. Wages require negotiation. Assets compound automatically. Wages stagnate. The system rewards what compounds. Those who own appreciating assets remain connected to growth. Those who rely on wages remain adjacent to it, but not integrated into it. This creates the illusion of participation without its benefits. People still work, they still pay, they still comply. But their outcomes no longer influence the system's direction. This is not exclusion, it is decoupling. The system does not push people out, it moves on without them. Corporate consolidation finalized the structure. As industries consolidated, competition narrowed. Fewer firms controlled more value. Decision-making centralized. Redundancy vanished. Large systems do not optimize for employment, they optimize for throughput. Employment is a byproduct, not an objective. This is why economic growth can coexist with widespread insecurity. The system measures success internally, not socially. Markets reflect profitability, not participation. Stock prices reflect efficiency, not employment. Growth reflects extraction, not stability. These signals are not broken, they are accurate. They reflect what the system now values. This is why traditional indicators stopped aligning with lived experience. The metrics evolved. The narrative did not. People continued measuring success by outdated standards: wages, jobs, ownership, security. The system moved on to new ones. This gap between measurement and reality is where confusion lives. Most people sense something is wrong but cannot locate it. They feel productive but insecure, employed but unstable, participating but excluded. This is not psychological, it is structural. They are participating in a system that no longer needs them to thrive. This realization is uncomfortable because it removes agency without assigning blame. There is no antagonist to oppose, no lever to pull, no policy that restores dependency. The incentives are already aligned. Once systems discover they can function with fewer constraints, they do not reverse course. Efficiency, once achieved, becomes the baseline. Human participation was a constraint. The system learned how to reduce it. This does not mean humans are obsolete. It means they are surplus to requirement. Surplus systems do not collapse. They stabilize. They become quieter, more efficient, more detached. This is why change feels slow rather than explosive. Nothing is breaking. Nothing is failing. The system is settling into its final form, and that form does not require widespread ownership, stable employment, or broad participation. It requires control, predictability, and extractable value. Those conditions are already met. What remains is adjustment. Younger generations will not experience this shift as loss. They will experience it as normal. They will not remember a time when ownership was expected. They will not expect stability from work. They will not assume participation guarantees security. They will grow up inside a system where access replaces permanence, where dependency replaces leverage, and where participation is optional. The system will continue to function. Markets will continue to operate. Companies will continue to grow. Technology will continue to advance. But the role humans once played will not return. Not because it was taken, because it was no longer required. The system no longer needs you, and it hasn't for some time. For more insights like this, like and subscribe.